Air Conditioning Weather Center and our meteorologist, Steve Williams.
Partly sunny today and a high at 87. Tonight, partly cloudy, low 71. Clouds and sun, humid tomorrow, breezy by the afternoon. Strong thunderstorm throughout the evening. They could bring hail, damaging wind, and the high 89. I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
65 at O'Hare. Next news at 7:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Make sure to check out the Income Store live video stream of today's show right now at 560theanswer.com.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy J this morning, Sean from Elmwood Park. Campus reform folks took a stroll around the campus of George Washington University over the Independence Day holiday weekend, asking the kids, college kids, what they think of America. Is America the greatest country in the world?
Do you think we're the greatest country in the world?
I don't think we're the greatest country in the world.
No.
No.
And do you think America is the greatest country in the world?
No. It's not the greatest country in the world.
What would you say is?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question because I don't feel like I can make an informed decision, but if I had to say, I would probably say Sweden.
Canada's doing it kind of well now, so I think Canada's is a front runner for greatest country.
Sweden, Norway, some of the more developed countries that have better health care.
I would say Nordic states, yeah. Iceland, people seem pretty happy there.
Oh, yeah, Iceland. Iceland is the greatest country in the world.
They thought they were, too, when they were kicking everyone's derriere, and all the men moved here to Illinois.
Yes, so it's interesting. The answers are very much like the answers you would get from the Bernie bros, right? From Bolshevik Bernie using Scandinavia as a model for healthcare for K through 12 education. Well, no, not for K through 12 education because in Sweden they have school choice. So can't use that. Got to pull that away. Actually, Sweden is rethinking their welfare state, so maybe unlimited entitlements is something else we couldn't lay at the doorstep of Sweden, and so emulate here. It turns out to be very complicated, but there's great romance the left has for those Nordic countries, and that certainly informs some of the proposals that are coming from the left, Kamala, Bernie, Warren, on housing, on education, both in terms of tuition as well as debt, and then, of course, on health care with Medicare for all. But is it all a thinly veiled war on the young, what the left is proposing, despite suggesting that everything they're proposing is for middle-income families and future generations, right? It's for the kids. It's always for the kids. Joseph Sternberg writes in the Wall Street Journal, think a student debt write-down and free college is a great deal? Wait until you see what you'll have to pay in return. Well, let's get some development of that statement. We're pleased to be joined by Joseph Sternberg, who is a columnist and editorial board member at the Wall Street Journal and author of the book, The Theft of a Decade, How the Baby Boomers Stole the Millennials' Economic Future. Joseph Sternberg, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning.
Morning. So think student debt write-down and free college, great deal. Wait until you see what you have to pay in return. It's sort of like PGR Works formulation. The good news about health care in Canada is it's free. The bad news is you're never going to get it. So explain to me what you're implying with your implicit criticism of the college and debt-free plans advanced by Bernie and Elizabeth Warren.
Well, what I find absolutely fascinating about these proposals is that these candidates are clearly trying to woo millennial voters, anyone who's in their 20s all the way up to their mid-30s at this point, who are facing serious personal financial problems often to do with the level of the student loans that they're trying to carry. And yet, these politicians are trying to be generous to millennials by giving millennials our own money back to us. And that was the basic point I wanted to make in the column I wrote in the Journal last week, it's not enough to look at who is the government going to give the money to. You also have to think about where is that money going to come from. I think that if we're in an environment where, certainly the government is still running deficits as we speak, so it can't pay its bills right now. We're staring down the barrel of uncountable tens of trillions of dollars in obligations for old age entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. That money is going to have to come from somewhere. Who is the generation that's actually going to have to pay for any of these additional student loan forgiveness or free college programs that some of the politicians in the Democratic primary want to create? And the answer is inevitably middle-class millennial taxpayers.
Well, Bernie and Elizabeth both say, no, the wealthy, financial transactions tax and a wealth tax.
Oh, well, they are certainly entitled to say that. But, another point that I think that millennials have to be really careful about is that anywhere that those taxes have been tried in the past, they never create the kind of revenue that their supporters promised in the beginning. That was certainly the experience in France, where the French scrapped their wealth tax in 2017, in part because it had never created the sort of revenue that they had hoped that it would. And instead, it was killing the kind of economic growth that they needed in order to pay all of their other bills. And so I think that, certainly you were playing a clip at the start of the segment of a lot of American college students saying that they look up to the Nordic countries like Sweden, Iceland. Well, the key feature of those countries is that it is the middle class that pays the bills. It's not the rich. It's actually very high rates of income taxation, consumption taxes like the value-added tax or VAT on the middle class and on people at lower incomes that you need in order to fund all of these programs that these politicians are trying to sell to millennial voters right now.
So, Joseph, socialism, as we know, is very expensive. And hasn't it always been built upon taxation of the future? I mean, isn't it all basically a Ponzi scheme from Social Security to Medicare to all of it? Isn't it just a hidden tax on the future that we've become comfortable with? And at the same time you have that, you've taught society through walking away from their debt of the, whether it be a mortgage or a student loan or whatever it is. Isn't it now, it's kind of a character, it used to be a character flaw to walk away from your debt. Isn't it now just part of the new America?
No, that is absolutely the problem that we've got here. I mean, a lot of these programs, including the versions that we have in America, even though we've never been a socialist country, we're always premised on having very strong economic growth in the future that you hoped would enable you to pay off those bills when they came due. And the problem is that the kind of taxation and other policies that you need in order to fund those programs right now can often strangle the economic growth that you're going to need in the future. So there's definitely an imbalance about that, and it has only gotten worse over the years as America faces now a demographic problem that didn't exist when Social Security was created in the 1930s, where now there are just fewer current workers for each retiree in the system. And this is an important point, I think, that all of these millennial voters need to think about, because this is really going to squeeze the resources that millennials will have available to act on our own policy priorities as we start getting elected to Congress in greater numbers. Or, one day we are going to have a president who is from the millennial generation. What are those politicians, what are those millennials going to be able to do to devote resources to our priorities if we're laboring under the burden of a lot of the debts that we have to pay off the bills of the boomers or our parents?
Well, I got some good news for you. This AP story, AP survey finding nearly 1 in 4 Americans have no plans to retire. About 1 in 5 people over the age of 65 were working or actively looking for a job as of last month. So maybe if people work, well into their, 70s and 80s, then we'll balance out the math.
Well, I think that is going to have to be part of the reality. I mean, there's going to be a justice issue to this, because certainly, even though you have more older people working now than might have been the case before, you still have a lot of them retiring and counting on these benefits that will ultimately be funded by younger working taxpayers. And those younger workers are not going to enjoy the same option to retire as early as some of today's retirees have done. So, you definitely get embroiled in a lot of these fairness issues. And the big point that I keep trying to make when I talk about these things is that I understand the frustration that a lot of millennial voters have when it comes to issues like student loans, when it comes to the fact that the labor market didn't really work for millennials in the early years after the Great Recession. That set us back a long time economically. But you have to be really careful about what kind of solution that you're going to look for, and we shouldn't accept solutions from older politicians like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders that are basically borrowing our own future from us.
So we have a system that I've been noticing for a while. I've always thought it was a hybrid, right? Where we have spot sections of our society where we advocate socialism and we turn a blind eye to its failures. But today, when the Republican version of economics, macroeconomics, is yesteryear's version of the Democrat Keynesianism, where it's all of this public funding and stimuluses, and we're calling for manipulated interest rates. I mean, aren't our choices either the hardcore socialism or the socialism light that the Republicans are promoting? And at what point are we past the point of no return?
Well, I think there's definitely a need in that for some kind of policy option to get out of these problems that's pulling us much more in a free market direction than what we're hearing from a lot of Republican politicians right now. I mean, the overarching all of this argument about millennial voters and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and student loans and any of the other giveaways that are targeting the young is the fact that a lot of young people are claiming that they embrace socialism right now. But I think that's because the politicians on the left right now are the only ones who are giving millennials a real alternative to that very narrow kind of half socialist, half market kind of very narrow lane that our country was traveling in for a long time. I mean, millennials understand that that doesn't work. But, millennials are not getting a really strong free market message from Republicans or other politicians on the right at the moment. And I think that we're going to need to fix that because if you look at polling data, millennials are not inherently socialist if you look at attitudes toward business or toward certain kinds of government activity, whatever we say when we're directly asked if we support socialism. But millennials do want alternatives, and I think we need to be mindful that following politicians who are really trying to just re-gift us our own future tax money is not the kind of alternative that we're looking for.
Yeah, right. I mean, I want to pick up on that being bribed with our own money sort of thing, because maybe what millennials learn from the baby boomers is you don't have to pay for the level of government you want. That's how we have $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities at the federal level, right? And so because the baby boomers were profligate with their progeny, the financial future of their progeny, why should we be any different? If you were entitled to Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid, then why can't we lard on all kinds of other entitlements that we won't pay for that we'll pass on to future generations? You broke the intergenerational compact, so why can't we?
Well, I think that the problem is that those bills do eventually come due, and I think that there's a very real risk that actually those bills come due, during the millennials' adulthood in a way that they never did during the boomers' adulthood. Because remember, the boomer problem on a lot of these old age entitlements like Social Security and Medicare is that they actually were paying somewhat more into the system than people were taking out of the system at that time. So, for much of the time that the boomers have been around, it has appeared as if these programs were working. Now, of course, that totally breaks down if you want to look at the long term and understand will a boomer pay in more over their lifetime than they will take out. And, of course, that bill is going to come due in the years to come. Millennials are the ones who are going to have to pay that. So I do wonder if some of these conversations are going to change a lot, because then we won't be talking about the speculative issue of whether it'll balance 20 or 30 years from now. Millennials are going to have a very real problem of figuring out where do we find the money to write these checks that people are demanding that we send out today.
And it seems like you're suggesting in your piece, and I suspect your book as well, that there has to be some leveling with the middle class here rather than these free lunch promises from politicians like Warren. You point out that 58% of the debt relief in Elizabeth Warren's free college plan would flood to households with incomes between $42,000 and $111,000. Kamala Harris just rolled out a housing plan that specifically focused on African American families household incomes up to 100 grand for an individual, or incomes up to 100 grand for an individual, 125 grand for a household. So it is sort of buying off middle income families. But as you point out at the end, but you have no idea what you're going to pay. You're not going to get an ROI, not only in the short term, but really if you project it out over the long term, you take a hammering because of all the bills that will come due, and you're the largest group. You're the largest group of beneficiaries, and you're also going to be the largest group of taxpayers.
Yeah, I think this is a big way that the way we talk about these issues in America needs to evolve, because you still hear a lot of the rhetoric focuses on trying to help people on lower incomes, or you talk about helping the poor or taxing the rich to benefit the poor. This is a big line that you often hear, but we need to recognize that what we're actually talking about here is the middle class. And one of America's great successes over the past couple of generations is that we have actually solved a lot of the problems that come with extreme poverty. So that isn't really the problem that we're talking about. And you know what? We should declare victory about that. That's a good thing. But then that means that you have to shift gears so that you can start having a conversation about what benefits does the middle class want versus what benefits can the middle class afford, especially when you factor in all of the taxes that have to pay for all of that.